Jake Callahan had spent his entire life on this land. It was more than soil and crops. It was history, family, and sacrifice. Unlike the modern corporate farm spreading like a disease, his land was a family operation, passed down for 3 generations. His grandfather had tilled these fields, his father had nurtured them, and now at 72, Jake was fighting to keep them alive. But progress, as they called it, did not care about history. The letter arrived on a windy afternoon, flapping against his old screen door. It was from the development company. Final notice. They were taking his land. Eminent domain, they claimed. A shopping center, a parking lot, a future he wanted no part of. He crushed the letter in his calloused hand, his heartbeat thundering. 50 years of sweat, of feeding his neighbors, of serving his country in a way few understood. Erased with ink on a piece of paper. Developers saw an old farm, but to the military this land was something else entirely. Every month for 40 years, Jake had maintained a special landing zone in his fields, just as his father had done during wars past. Helicopters needed a place to train, a spot for young pilots to practice nighttime landings. Jake had made sure they had it. When they called, he would rush outside, setting out markers, ensuring their path was clear. His wife, Sophia, would brew coffee for the crews, waiting by the porch, ready to welcome them like family. Loyalty still meant something in this country. That was what Jake believed. But as he stared out at the horizon, watching the sun dip below the trees, he felt something he had never felt before. Helplessness. The developers were coming tomorrow. He knew what that meant. He had seen how this worked. They would show up with their lawyers, their paperwork, and their quiet threats. He could fight, but it would not change anything. His heart ached at the thought of his wife watching as their home, his father's home, was ripped away. That night, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the last cup of coffee Sophia had made for him. He could still hear the distant echoes of helicopter rotors in his mind, the voices of young soldiers who had once landed on his fields. He had done right by them. Would anyone do right by him? Then somewhere in the distance he heard a sound, faint at first, a deep, steady thumping. His breath caught in his chest. He knew that sound. Helicopter rotors. Jake Callahan pushed back his chair, his pulse hammering in his ears. The sound grew louder, shaking the walls of his farmhouse. He rushed to the porch, his breath visible in the cool night air. The sky was dark, but he could see it now, silhouetted against the moon, cutting through the clouds like a ghost. An Apache helicopter. It descended fast, kicking up dust and leaves, its powerful rotor wash bending the tall grass of his fields. Jake shielded his eyes as the machine settled onto the special landing zone he had maintained for decades. The same field where he had watched young pilots train, where he had stayed up late, setting out markers so they could learn to land in the dark. The side door swung open, and a figure dropped to the ground. Tall, broad-shouldered, a silhouette against the blinking red and green lights of the chopper. The man moved with purpose, boots crunching against the dirt. Then, as he stepped forward into the porch light, Jake recognized the face. It had been years, decades maybe, but he would never forget. "Chief?" Jake's voice was barely a whisper. The man grinned, the same easy smile Jake remembered from long ago. "Still keeping the lights on for us, old man?" Jake exhaled, shaking his head. "I thought you were gone," Chief chuckled. "Not yet." He glanced around, his smile fading as he took in the state of things. The worn farmhouse, the tire tracks from the developer's surveyors, the tension in Jake's eyes. "I heard what's happening." Jake clenched his jaw. "There is nothing anyone can do. They have the law on their side." Chief crossed his arms, considering. The wind howled through the trees, but the Apache remained steady, a silent beast waiting in the darkness. Then Chief spoke, his voice steady. "You kept your word all these years, Jake. Never asked for anything in return. Maybe it is time someone returned the favor." Jake frowned. "What are you saying?" Chief reached into his jacket, pulled out a small device and held it up. A secure military phone, the kind that only a select few had access to. "I made a call on the way here," Chief said. "Help is coming." Jake stared at him. "Help?" Chief just smiled, and then in the distance more lights appeared, low, Fast-moving. Dozens of them. Jake swallowed hard. More helicopters. Jake Callahan stood frozen on his porch, the night air buzzing with the unmistakable sound of approaching helicopters. More than a dozen, flying low, their lights slicing through the darkness like silent sentinels. His heart pounded. He had spent years helping young soldiers train here, but never had he seen something like this. Chief stood beside him, arms crossed, eyes locked on the approaching aircraft. "You always told us this place was home," he said. "Tonight, we prove you were right." The first helicopter touched down just beyond the Apache, its side door sliding open before it had even settled. Men in dark uniforms leaped out, moving with purpose. More choppers landed in quick succession, their powerful downdraft bending the fields. Jake had spent half his life maintaining this landing zone for the military, but tonight it was different. This was not a training exercise. Jake turned to Chief. "Who are these men?" Chief smirked. "Friends?" Within seconds, the farm was swarming with activity. Soldiers, some young, some seasoned, moved with the kind of efficiency that came from years of experience. They spoke in quiet, focused tones, scanning the property, setting up what looked like a temporary command post near the barn. A man in a crisp officer's uniform approached. He was older, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He stopped in front of Jake, extending a hand. "Colonel Matthews," he said, "I have been hearing about you for years, Mr. Callahan." Jake shook his hand, his grip firm despite the whirlwind around him. "I do not understand what is happening." Matthews gave a knowing smile. "You have been helping us for decades, Jake. You never asked for anything. Well, it turns out the people you helped, they do not forget." Jake felt his throat tighten, but he kept his expression steady. "And what exactly are you planning to do?" Matthews nodded toward the horizon. "Developers are coming in the morning, right?" Jake nodded. Matthews clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Then by morning they will understand one thing. This land is not just dirt, it is history, and history does not get bulldozed." Jake exhaled slowly, taking it all in. His land, his fight, had just become something much bigger. Chief grinned. "Get some rest, old man. Tomorrow's going to be interesting." Jake glanced toward the helicopters, the soldiers, the men who had come without hesitation. For the first time in weeks, he felt something he had lost. Hope. Dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and gold. Jake Callahan stood on his porch, a hot cup of coffee in hand, watching the first dust clouds rise in the distance. The developers were coming, right on schedule. Behind him, the farm was alive with movement. Soldiers moved with quiet precision, their presence undeniable but controlled. They were not here for a fight. They were here to send a message. A convoy of black SUVs rolled up the dirt road, their polished exteriors gleaming under the morning sun. The lead vehicle stopped first, and out stepped a man in a crisp suit, the kind that screamed expensive meetings and ruthless deals. His expression was smug, until he looked around. His confidence wavered. The property was lined with military personnel, standing at ease but unmistakably present. Helicopters sat like sleeping giants in the field, their massive rotor blades still, but their mere presence radiated power. A few men in uniform observed from a distance, speaking quietly into radios. Jake took a slow sip of coffee, waiting. The suited man cleared his throat. "Mr. Callahan, I am David Langley, Regional Director of Atlantic Development Group. We are here to finalize the—" "No, you are not." Langley blinked. "Excuse me." Colonel Matthews stepped forward, flanked by two officers. "Mr. Callahan's land has been under voluntary military cooperation for decades. Your company failed to recognize its historical and national significance." He handed Langley a thick folder. "This is a petition backed by veterans, active duty personnel, and senior officials. It has reached Washington." Langley's confidence cracked. He flipped through the pages, eyes widening. This is not possible. We had government approval." Matthews smirked. "Not anymore." Chief stepped forward, arms crossed. "This land has trained generations of pilots. It has saved lives before they were even deployed. You think a shopping mall is going to erase that?" He shook his head. "Not today." Langley's face turned pale. He knew a losing battle when he saw one. Without another word, he turned and stalked back to his SUV. The convoy reversed, kicking up dust as they fled. Jake exhaled, watching them go. He turned to Chief. "That is it?" Chief smiled. "That is it." The tension in Jake's chest finally released. He looked around at the people who had come to stand beside him. Soldiers, pilots, men who had once been boys training in his fields. Loyalty still meant something in this country. As the helicopters lifted off one by one, Jake stood tall, his land still his. And this time, nothing would take it away.